Hello again and welcome back to another video, and today we're looking at a scenario where the Soviet Union united today in 2023. This happening would immediately destroy global relations. A new superpower has just popped up which controls a massive portion of the global industry and a insanely large population, rivaling even that of the US. The economy of this new nation would not be the highest, I will say that right now. The Russian and Ukrainian economies have been heavily impacted by the war. Central Asia is by no means the richest area, and the Baltics are far too small to contribute much either. The richest areas would most likely be over in their client states in East Germany, parts of Poland, Czechia, or parts of Austria. Meanwhile, the regions they took over in Central Asia would still benefit them, but they are significantly poor regions. I also added in practically any lands that they had full or partial control over. So this is right after the World War, before Austria was reunified, so they still own a portion of that. They have major influence and are very much so aligned with Yugoslavia, who I also brought back just to elevate Soviet position in this world. They occupy parts of northern Iran. They have practically full control of Mongolia and just got themselves North Korea. Not technically their puppet, but very much so under their influence. We're also going to assume that several organizations like NATO just dissolve for some reason or another. Another one can pop up, but for now there is no organization to truly stop or put an end to this new age of Russian dominance. I don't want to say Russian dominance. This may be the largest nation in the world and the second largest military power. It would still not even come close to the American economy. It would most likely be weaker than China as well. And although it does have major influence in Eastern Europe, it would still not be enough to elevate it above the US or even close to the US when it comes to global affairs. First thing they would want to do is change that. The first way they're going to do that is by taking advantage of the collapse of NATO to crush Southern Europe and get it under their control. If they can get all these nations even just under their influence, it would allow the Soviet Union to far easier control Black Sea ports, which is where a lot of their imports come from, and especially exports from the breadbasket of Ukraine and the rest of southern Russia. This war would not be the largest challenge, well, at least it doesn't seem like it, but considering how difficult the war has been in Ukraine for the Russians, I do think they will struggle at least during the beginning parts of the war. Turkey is by no means a weak nation. It may not be the strongest that there is, but an invasion would be slow and painful. In the east, they began an invasion into Turkish mountains, getting closer and closer to Kurdistan, which they hope will rise up on their side. They also immediately cut off Greece and Turkey, whilst nearing the city of Istanbul, the largest city in Europe and in Turkey as well. Albania, however, would not be much of a challenge as they swiftly sweep over the nation and capture the rest of northern Greece. They then push along the Greek coast, managing to capture Athens. And although they do struggle in some more mountainous Greek territories, Greece could not hold on forever against this absolute overmight of the Soviet Union. Soon enough, Istanbul would also fall, and a push into northern Turkey would devastate the nation. We're also going to assume that a few things go right for them, such as the Kurds rebelling on their side, allowing them to take control of southern Turkey far easier, and to reach the Mediterranean Sea. From here, they would greatly support some Syrian elements in their favor, hoping to completely take over the nation under their control. This would go successfully, and soon enough a puppet regime would be set up in Syria, whilst Greece completely capitulates under the Soviet boot. Northern Turkey would fall as well, as even though the Turks are taking a third as many casualties as the Soviets, they would still lose eventually. Multiple naval invasions in the Black Sea, which the Soviets now have full control of, and along the coast, capturing Izmir, and soon enough even the Turkish capital in Ankara, would eventually capitulate Turkey, even if it does take them years. The split of these lands would be about what you'd expect, except for one major thing. I am going to be expanding Bulgaria down into Greece massively. Is this the most realistic thing? Maybe not. But it is what I'm going to be using here as Bulgaria is expanded into a much, much more powerful nation, gaining many lands from Greece and even certain lands from Turkey. Turkey would also lose many, many lands in the east as the Soviets push their advantage far south. They do set up an independent Kurdish country, but it is fairly weak. They would also directly annex the Bosporus Strait, which controls entry into the Black Sea. They would set up a puppet regime in the rest of Turkey. Meanwhile, in Albania would actually be expanded into Kosovo to limit any kind of Albanian resistance. Along with this, Yugoslavia would lose Macedonia. This is in an effort to hold down Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia is their ally, which is why I brought them back. I wanted to ensure that the Soviets did better in this world than they would have done if Yugoslavia wasn't brought back. But the Soviets do not want Yugoslavia to separate themselves from them, and thus will weaken them to a point where they will rely on the Soviet Union to the point where they simply cannot rise up without risking some form of collapse or loss of food, loss of resources, etc. However, this would lead to a big Bulgaria, very much so like a big Bulgaria. Why? Because a big Bulgaria looks very, very good on a map. This would also not be too impossible to control as Macedonians and Bulgarians are fairly close. But many of these territories would have Greek and Turkish majorities, if not the minorities. So it wouldn't be the easiest to hold on to. Yugoslavia would also be closer integrated. Meanwhile, in northern Iran, they assert their influence, hoping to march down further into the nation. This would happen even before the end of the Turkish peace treaties, as the Soviets decide that their influence is just simply not enough and start an invasion into the rest of the north. Iran would take this as a full declaration of war, as who could not take a massive invasion as a declaration of war? And yeah, that would not go very well. This war would most likely go even worse for the Soviets than the last one, as they would take far more casualties than the Iranians who were fighting in the mountains, but they still could not win. The Iranians simply could not win against the Soviets, who would eventually use overwhelming manpower and possibly even some amount of overwhelming technology at this point. From there, they would conquer Iraq, who would expand out into Iran, and at this point, they are simply hoping to become self-sufficient. Much of the world has already embargoed them, and those who have not are cutting off relations, cutting off ties, and will eventually. In Soviet eyes, they have to take as much land as they can before a global organization stops them to become as self-sufficient as possible and no longer rely on any exports or imports of any sort. This may not be the best idea, as most of the time specializing in certain things and importing stuff from other places while you export to them is actually the better idea. In this case, the Soviets simply cannot do that, as the world is not their friend and does not want to trade with them at all. They have, however, in my opinion at least, grown their influence to the point where they will never even get close to the US in power, but may be able to be large enough and strong enough to supply themselves indefinitely. Also, I almost forgot to mention it, this is a not realistic scenario. There's absolutely no way this could have happened. Even if they survived, this is just simply impossible. This is completely for fun to see how strong they could possibly get in the modern day with practically no threats against them. And the answer is pretty strong. Let's just go ahead and drag this right on over the United States of America. Their simple country itself could cover the entire US, with many lands left to spare. They could stretch from Florida all the way to Iraq, or from Australia about halfway to Brazil. They are absolutely massive, and I doubt you can really just collapse that immediately. In real life, this would collapse immediately as the people inside of it would rebel, Ukraine would rebel, the Baltics would rebel, Central Asia may rebel, and the world would supply all of those rebellions. But in this scenario, we're assuming that everyone just says, yay, I love the Soviets, and decides not to rebel against them. Why? Because there's absolutely no other way they could survive. After securing their influence in the Middle East, and thus their oil supply, they decide to refocus on Europe. At this point, some form of organization led by the US would have been fully created, in which the Western powers of the UK and France would join in, along with the Benelux, and sadly for the Soviets, they were too late to get to Germany or Italy. Luckily for them, they can crush Austria, but not in their entirety. Austria would be divided, as about half of it joins together with Germany, and the other half is given to the Soviet Union. Joining with Germany was not really much of a choice, but it was a far better option than being controlled entirely by the Soviets, which is what happened to the rest of the country. Would this benefit the Germans at all? Not really. They lost their east. This would not be a good scenario for them at all. The Soviets would then start their influence into the Nordics, and although I'm not going to map it out, as it would be very similar to the other wars, throw bodies at them until they give up. That is the current Soviet strategy, and although it would lead to a massive loss of life, it would work. They annexed much of northern Finland and a small amount of the east in order to completely destroy the nation. This was in an effort to crush any Finnish resistance movements that may have happened or may threaten the Soviet Union into the future. We're also assuming that nuclear weapons cannot be used in this timeline, as if they could, the world would have blown itself up by now. Although, since the Soviets did take a very long time to invade the Middle East, sadly for them, the rest of Europe has managed to join together with the Americans, and the Soviets do not really want to start that war. In a direct conflict between these yellow nations and the red nations, I do think the Soviets would win. Why? Because the Americans are all the way over here, whilst Europe is over here, and when you pin these European nations alone against this absolutely massive Soviet Union and their allies, the Soviets would win. I'm going to be showing that conflict at the end, as this is going to be a Soviet victory scenario. But for now, they are simply going to continue to expand their influence, especially into Africa, where they try and gain themselves some allies. By the end of a few more years, a war would be seemingly unstoppable. I would have put a few more conflicts, but honestly, I don't think anybody could wait very much longer. A war would very, very soon break out between the American-led faction and the Soviet Union and their allies. In this war, Europe would fall. The Americans would attempt to aid them, but without nuclear weapons, and nothing really that can be done against this absolute Soviet overmight. The Americans would send over as many troops as they can. It would not be enough. First of all would be Germany, who loses much of their lands immediately at the start of the war. Technically, Denmark is the first to capitulate, but Germany really does not stand much of a chance here on their own. They've lost many lands, and along with that, despite having the mountains to protect them, northern Italy will fall as well. Soon enough, the Allied powers will attempt to set up along the Rhine and protect themselves there. That would not work, as a breakthrough in the Netherlands would crush French defenses, and soon enough, France would capitulate. After only having Soviet troops in there, let's say 3 weeks? This French capitulation would be the end for Europe. In the north, the Soviets had begun an invasion of Sweden, but now after a successful naval invasion in the south, the Swedes had fully capitulated. The Norwegians wouldn't last much longer, as with the fall of their south and most major cities, they would also not last for very much longer. This would basically put in the end of the American domination. Italy would be next to fall as the entire north capitulates and thus the country surrenders. And as for Spain, they could not last forever. At this point, American troops are here, but it is simply just not enough to stop the absolute Soviet overmight. There is another scenario that shows a more conservative Soviet effort, which I think would fail, and would give the Americans enough time to resupply. Sadly for the Soviets, their navy could not defeat the Americans, which is actually what is keeping the British alive. So I do not know if they could complete a full victory. Along with that, resistance in these new countries would be absolutely massive. But with the cutoff of the Mediterranean, they would take full control of it. And soon enough, the Americans would be forced to start to negotiate, as if China decided to block off the US at this point, the United States' economy, which is already suffering massively, would completely collapse, with a lot of the world no longer willing to trade with them, and a lot of Africa now being Soviet aligned after they send many aid projects to the continent. Let's go ahead and see what this peace treaty would have looked like. It's really nothing too far off from what you may have expected. France would be destroyed as the north of the country is given over to a new Belgian state, which would soon unite with the Netherlands. As for the Nordics, well, it would be a division. The Soviets would get the north, along with all of their Baltic Sea islands, along with the southern Sweden, and Copenhagen, the most important area of Denmark, along with a small port city in the north of Denmark, would be directly ceded to the Soviet Union. This would be all in an effort to secure Soviet ports going into the future, hopefully indefinitely. They have now secured the Black Sea, and now having good relations with Egypt, and having access to the Strait of Gibraltar, the Americans and their friends can no longer just block off the Russians from the world trade. That is an absolutely major victory, as the Russians are now not nearly as threatened by the Americans, who still have a larger economy, but simply could not win in a future war, due to them, well, being an ocean away. The UK is still technically alive, but I do not know how much longer they would last. The Americans are starting to leave the European continent, hoping to prop up some of their neighbors in an effort to form up a new organization in the Americas to stop this Soviet advance. I don't know how well that would go. If the Soviet Union at this point played their cards right, they may even be able to get important countries like India, at least partially on their side, which would be the end of America. If a new war broke out and the Soviets were able to get both China and India on their side, the US's economy would completely collapse, especially if the Middle East also joined against them. It would simply not be possible to hold on to. Germany, however, would now benefit. Most of the fighting actually took place in Germany, as that was at the beginning of the war, before the Soviets could really get going. But by the end of this, they have now been able to unite with Austria, which, hey, at least they gained something from this. Meanwhile, France, who had probably been the most annoying for the Soviet Union to defeat, would be the most harshly punished. They would lose many lands in the north, along with losing lands to Spain in the south, and Italy over in the east. France would also become a Soviet puppet, and would have to pay the Soviets a large amount of money to make up for Soviet losses whilst taking over the territory. They may even be forced to give up more lands to the Germans, but the Soviets, in this case, to be able to do all of this to begin with, cannot be that dumb to make Germany so powerful that they could stand up to the Soviets themselves, or lead some kind of European resistance against them. This is also where I'm going to end it. They are in a very good position. The Americans are still technically stronger, but they are across an ocean and cannot really stop the Soviets from doing much. The Soviets now control about half of the world's oil supply directly, and indirectly control pretty much all of it. They would have already collapsed years before this in the real world, but if we assume they can hold together, they have truly set up their own sphere across the world. Perhaps an invasion of Afghanistan, further into the Middle East, or even into Africa could come soon. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you all next time. Goodbye.